She's not dead. You poisoned her." The words cut through the ICU like a blade of ice, sharp enough to make every doctor freeze mid-step as the heart monitor flattened into a long, unforgiving line. And in that exact second when time seemed to collapse in on itself, a barefoot boy with dirt on his sleeves stood in the doorway where security had just failed to hold him back, his chest rising fast, his eyes locked not on the doctors, not on the machines, but on the still body of Lily Hayes, the only daughter of one of the most powerful women in the state. A girl who had been unresponsive for 6 months inside a hospital room that cost more per night than most families made in a week. And yet none of that money, none of that power, had been enough to bring her back. Victoria Hayes stood beside the bed in a tailored black coat that had not moved in hours, her hand wrapped around her daughter's fingers as if she could anchor her to this world by force alone. Her voice gone from crying too much and saying too little. And when the boy spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow louder than everything else in the room, she turned, slowly, like someone who already knew that whatever came next would change everything. While across the room Daniel Reeves, the company's CFO, adjusted his cufflinks with a precision that felt out of place in a moment like this, his posture stiff, his expression controlled, too controlled, as if he were waiting for something to end rather than hoping for it to continue. "Get him out," one of the doctors said, finally finding his voice, but the boy didn't move, didn't even blink. He just stepped closer, one quiet step across polished marble floors that reflected everything except the truth. And for a moment no one stopped him, not because they trusted him, but because something in the way he moved made stopping him feel like a mistake no one wanted to make twice. "She can hear me," he said. And that was when the room shifted, not visibly, not loudly, but in that subtle way a storm announces itself before the first drop falls, because somewhere deep inside that silence, someone realized this boy wasn't guessing, he wasn't hoping, he was certain. Victoria's fingers tightened around her daughter's hand, her breath catching as if she were standing at the edge of something she couldn't see yet, and Daniel's gaze flickered, just once, toward the machines, then back to the boy, a crack so small most people would miss it. But not the boy, not Ethan, because he saw everything. And as he reached the side of the bed, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, every heartbeat in the room waiting for something no one could name. And when he leaned down, his voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for Lily. He's still in the room. And somewhere behind him, a man who had been perfectly still for too long finally felt the first trace of fear. The machines did not lie, but they did not tell the whole truth either. And as the faintest ripple disturbed the flat line, so subtle it could have been dismissed as interference, Ethan did not look at the monitor. He looked at Daniel. And that was when Victoria noticed it. Not the sound, not the movement, but the direction of the boy's attention, like he was following something invisible that no one else could see. "What did you just say?" Victoria's voice came out low and strained, her eyes moving between the boy and the man standing near the window. And Daniel forced a small smile, the kind that belonged in boardrooms and press conferences, not hospital rooms. "This is not the time for distractions," he said carefully, each word placed like a stone, steady, controlled. But there was something beneath it now, something tighter, like a string pulled just a little too far. Ethan did not answer him. Instead, he leaned closer to Lily. Again, his fingers resting lightly on her wrist, not pressing, not forcing, just there, as if he were reminding her of something she already knew. "You remember," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You remember what he did." And the air shifted again, heavier this time, because memory is a powerful thing. And in that room filled with machines and silence, it felt like something was trying to rise to the surface. The monitor gave a soft, uneven sound, not steady, not strong, but undeniably real, and one of the nurses gasped before covering her mouth, as if afraid to scare the moment away, while the doctor stepped forward, confusion written all over his face, checking the lines, the readings, searching for a reason that fit inside logic. Victoria's hand tightened around her daughter's, her breath catching in her chest as she leaned closer. "Lily," she whispered, not a command, not a plea, but something in between, something fragile and desperate and full of hope she had not allowed herself to feel for months. And for a second nothing happened, the kind of second that stretches long enough to break a person, and then it came, not dramatic, not loud, Just a small movement, a single finger curling against her palm, and the room stopped again, completely, because everyone knew what that meant. Daniel's composure flickered, just for a heartbeat, his eyes darting toward the door, as if calculating distance, time, options. But there were too many eyes now, too many witnesses, and the silence around him had changed. It was no longer passive, it was watching. "This is impossible," he said, but the words sounded thinner than before, like they had lost weight on the way out. And Ethan finally stood up straight, turning just enough to look at him directly, not angry, not accusing, just certain, and certainty is far more dangerous than emotion. "She was never gone," Ethan said, his voice calm, steady, the kind of calm that does not need to prove itself. "She was waiting." And Victoria felt something shift inside her, something sharp and clear, like a puzzle piece sliding into place after months of confusion, because she remembered the reports, the inconsistencies, the small details that never quite added up, things she had pushed aside because grief leaves no room for suspicion. But now those details were coming back, one by one, lining up in a way she could not ignore. The monitor found a rhythm, still weak, still uneven, but alive, undeniably alive. And Lily's lips parted slightly as if she were trying to reach the surface of something deep and heavy, her eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, and then, slowly, they opened, not fully, not yet, but enough to show awareness, enough to show that she was there. And the first place her gaze moved, the very first, was not to her mother, not to the doctors, but across the room, straight to Daniel Reeves. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, everyone understood that whatever had happened here was not over, it had only just begun. "Say it." Ethan's voice came soft but unyielding, cutting through the fragile silence as Lily's eyes, still heavy and unfocused, struggled to stay open yet refused to look away from Daniel. And in that locked gaze something passed between them that no machine could measure and no doctor could explain, something that felt like truth rising to the surface whether anyone was ready or not. Victoria leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest, her voice trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Lily, sweetheart, can you hear me?" And for a moment it seemed like the world held its breath again, the kind of pause that decides everything. And then Lily's lips moved, barely, just enough to form a whisper that cracked through the room like glass. "He changed it." And the words were faint, fragile, but they landed with a weight that shifted every eye toward Daniel Reeves. "This is absurd," Daniel replied quickly, too quickly, his voice rising just a fraction as he straightened his posture, the confidence still there, but now edged with something sharper, something defensive. "She has been unconscious for months. She is confused." But confusion does not point with precision, and Lily's trembling hand lifted slightly, not strong, not steady, but deliberate, her finger moving just enough to indicate him. And that was when the room changed again, not just in feeling but in direction, because doubt had found its target. One of the doctors stepped forward, glancing between the monitor and Lily's face, trying to anchor himself in science. But science does not always arrive first. Sometimes truth does. And Victoria felt it now, cold and clear, threading through every memory she had pushed aside, every report that never quite aligned, every moment she had chosen grief over suspicion, and now those choices were unraveling. What did she mean? Victoria asked, her voice no longer trembling but tightening, focusing, turning into something sharper, something that had built companies and protected empires. And Daniel hesitated, just for a second. A small pause that would have gone unnoticed in any other room, but here it echoed. "Medication schedules are complex," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There are many variables." But Ethan shook his head once, slow. "Certain, no," he said, and his voice did not rise, did not argue it. Simply replaced everything else. Not variables, choices. And the difference between those two words settled heavily into the space between them. The monitor continued its uneven rhythm, each beep louder now, stronger, as if Lily herself were pushing against something unseen, her breathing shallow but present, her gaze still fixed, unwavering, and the nurse nearest the door quietly reached for her phone, not out of panic but procedure, because something in this room had crossed from medical into something else entirely. Victoria straightened slowly, her hand still holding her daughter's, but her eyes now on Daniel, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but measuring, calculating, the way she had done in boardrooms for years, and Daniel saw it. He saw the shift, the moment when grief steps aside and clarity takes its place. And for the first time since he walked into that room, he looked like a man who had run out of moves. Check everything, Victoria said, her voice low but absolute, directed at no one and everyone at once. Every record, every log, every change. And the command did not echo. It landed, because people understood it was no longer a request. Ethan stepped back then, quietly, as if his part in this moment was already complete, his eyes lingering on Lily for just a second longer before lifting toward the doorway. And when Victoria turned to him, ready to ask the question that had been building since the moment he spoke, there was only empty space. Where he had been standing, no sound, no footsteps, no explanation, just absence. And in a room that had just witnessed the impossible, that absence somehow felt like the most impossible thing of all. Find him, Victoria said, and this time her voice carried no hesitation, no grief, only precision, the kind that built empires and dismantled them when necessary. And within seconds the quiet hospital floor transformed into something sharper, more alert, as security moved, as staff exchanged looks, as systems that had been background noise suddenly became tools of focus. The nurse by the door spoke into her phone in a low, controlled tone, requesting immediate review of surveillance footage, while a second doctor stepped out to contact administration, and Daniel remained exactly where he was. But stillness can reveal more than movement, and now his stillness felt deliberate, calculated, like a man trying not to disturb a surface that had already begun to crack. Victoria did not look at him yet, not fully, because she understood timing. She understood that truth is strongest when it arrives on its own terms, and instead she turned back to Lily, her hand steady now, her voice calm in a way it had not been for months. "You are safe," she said, not asking, not wondering, but stating it as something that would become true because she said it, and Lily's eyes, still heavy but clearer than before, flickered again, her breathing finding a slightly stronger rhythm, each inhale shallow but certain, and the machines responded, their tones adjusting, aligning with something that was no longer fading but returning. "The logs," Victoria said without turning, and one of the doctors nodded quickly, understanding exactly what she meant, because in a place like this everything is recorded, every dosage, every change, every signature. Nothing disappears unless someone makes it disappear, and that realization moved through the room like a quiet current, touching everyone differently, but leaving no one untouched. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then stepped forward just enough to re-enter the center of the conversation. "Victoria, I understand this is emotional," he began, his tone measured, controlled, familiar, but now it felt rehearsed in a way it had not before. "But we should rely on verified data, not assumptions." And for the first time Victoria looked at him directly, fully, her gaze sharp, unwavering, and there was something in her expression that made the room feel smaller, tighter, because she was no longer searching for answers, she was confirming them. "That is exactly what we are going to do," she replied, and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was not, because she was not arguing, she was closing a distance that could not be reopened. Behind them, a technician's voice came through the doorway, quiet but urgent. "We have footage," and that sentence alone shifted everything again, because evidence does not ask for permission, it arrives and demands to be seen. Victoria did not move immediately. Instead she looked down at Lily once more, her fingers brushing lightly against her daughter's hand, grounding herself in what mattered most, and Lily's gaze, though tired, remained focused, aware, present, and that presence was the anchor that held everything together. Then Victoria stood, slowly, deliberately, every movement controlled, and turned toward the door. "Bring it here," she said, not raising her voice, because she did not need to, and as the screen was wheeled in, casting a soft glow across the polished floor, Daniel's reflection appeared faintly on its surface, just for a moment, and in that reflection, for the first time, there was no confidence left to hide behind, only the quiet recognition that whatever had been hidden was about to step into the light. And somewhere beyond the doorway, unnoticed by everyone except the camera that briefly caught an empty hallway, the place where Ethan had stood remained undisturbed, as if he had never been there at all, and yet everything he had said was now unfolding exactly as promised. "Play it from 1 hour before the last dosage change," Victoria said, her voice steady as the screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow across faces that were no longer just witnesses but participants in something far bigger than a medical anomaly. And the footage began without drama, just a quiet hallway, polished floors, nurses passing, the ordinary rhythm of a place built on routine. But routine is where truth hides best. And as the timestamp moved forward second by second, the room leaned into the silence, every eye fixed, every breath measured, until a familiar figure appeared on the screen, Daniel Reeves, walking with the same composed stride he carried into boardrooms, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable, and for a moment nothing seemed out of place, because power rarely announces itself as danger, it presents itself as normal. "Pause," Victoria said softly, and the image froze. Daniel's hand just inches from the door to Lily's room, a detail so small it would have meant nothing before, but now it carried weight, and as the footage resumed, he entered, alone, no nurse, no doctor, no recorded reason, just him, stepping into a space where every second was supposed to be accounted for, and behind Victoria, someone shifted, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the moment when doubt became direction. "Zoom," she said, and the technician complied, tightening the frame, bringing the small movements into focus, Daniel's hand adjusting something on the tray, his body positioned just enough to block the camera's full view, not obvious, not careless, but intentional in a way that now felt impossible to ignore, and in the room, no one spoke, because the silence was doing the work for them, filling in the gaps that words could not. The footage continued, showing him leaving exactly as he entered, calm, unhurried, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that now felt louder than any alarm. And when the screen went still again, the room did not move. It held, suspended in that thin space between seeing and accepting. "That proves nothing," Daniel said. But the confidence in his voice had shifted, not gone, but altered, like a structure that still stands but no longer feels stable. And Victoria did not respond immediately, because she understood something he did not, that truth does not need to rush. It arrives fully formed when it is ready, and she turned instead to the doctor beside her. "Cross-reference that time with the medication logs," she said, and within seconds the system was pulled up, numbers, entries, signatures, all the things that are meant to make reality measurable. And there it was, a change, small, precise, recorded under authorization that now felt heavier than ink on a screen. Lily's breathing grew steadier behind them, each inhale a quiet declaration that she was still here, still present, still able to witness what was unfolding, and her eyes, though tired, remained open, watching, not just surviving but remembering. And Victoria felt it again, that alignment of detail and instinct. The moment when everything that did not make sense finally did. Daniel took a step back, just one, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but in a room that had stopped missing details, it was seen, understood, cataloged, and for the first time since this began, he did not speak, because silence, when it comes from someone who always is words, is not absence, it is admission waiting for form, and Victoria stepped closer, not rushed, not emotional, but precise, every inch of distance closing like a decision being finalized. And as she looked at him, not as a colleague, not as a partner, but as something else entirely, something revealed rather than assumed, the weight of the room shifted once more, because everyone understood that what had been hidden in routine had just been pulled into light, and there would be no returning it to shadow. "You authorized it," Victoria said, her voice quiet but unmovable, as the timestamp on the screen glowed beside the altered entry, and the room no longer felt like a place of uncertainty, but a place where conclusions were beginning to settle into place, one by one, like pieces locking into a design that had always been there waiting to be seen. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched longer than any denial could have, because silence at the wrong time reveals more than words ever could. and when he finally spoke, his tone had changed again, less controlled, less certain. "There are protocols, adjustments happen," he said, but the words did not land the way they once would have. They did not carry authority anymore. They sounded like something trying to hold its shape while already breaking apart. Victoria stepped closer, not aggressively, not emotionally, but with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed confirmation. "Adjustments are recorded with reason," she replied, her eyes fixed on him. "Explain this one." And for a moment the room narrowed to just the two of them, everything else fading into the background, the machines, the staff, the quiet movement of people who now understood they were witnessing something far beyond a medical case. Behind her, Lily's breathing grew stronger, not steady yet, but present, persistent, each breath a quiet resistance against whatever had tried to silence her, and her eyes remained open, watching, aware, as if she understood more than anyone else in that room, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Daniel glanced toward the door again, a reflex he could not control, and that single movement spoke louder than anything he could have said, because people who have nothing to hide do not look for exits, and Victoria saw it, registered it, and filed it away without reaction, because she did not need to react anymore. She only needed to proceed. "Secure all internal access," she said without raising her voice. And immediately 2 members of hospital security stepped closer, not touching, not intervening, but present in a way that changed the balance of the room, and Daniel felt it, the shift from influence to limitation, the moment when control leaves quietly but completely. "You are making a mistake," he said, but now the words sounded distant, like they belonged to someone else, someone who still believed the situation could be redirected. But the room had already moved past that point, and Victoria shook her head. Once, not in anger, not in frustration, but in clarity. "No," she said. "I stopped making mistakes the moment she opened her eyes," and that sentence settled into the air with a finality that left no space for argument. The technician adjusted the screen, pulling up additional logs, cross-references, patterns that had been invisible before but now stood out with sharp definition. Small changes repeated over time, subtle enough to avoid attention, precise enough to create an outcome, and the realization moved through the room like a quiet wave, because this was not a single moment. It was a sequence, a plan that had been unfolding in silence until something interrupted it. Victoria turned slightly, just enough to look at Lily again, and for the first time since this began, there was something in her expression that was not grief, not even anger, but something deeper, something resolute. The kind of strength that does not announce itself, but changes everything around it. And Lily's eyes met hers, a silent connection passing between them, fragile but unbreakable. When Victoria turned back, her focus returned sharper than before. "We are done discussing this," she said, and the room understood, not because of the words, but because of the certainty behind them. And as Daniel stood there, no longer speaking, no longer directing, just present in a space that had moved beyond him, the truth that had been hidden inside routine, inside trust, inside silence, now stood fully exposed, and there was no place left for it to hide. "There is one more thing," the nurse said quietly from the corner, her voice careful but firm, and in a room that had already shifted so many times. Even a small interruption now carried weight, pulling every eye toward her as she held up a tablet, the glow reflecting in her glasses. The system flagged an access anomaly from earlier today, and the words landed softly but precisely, like a final piece being placed where it could no longer be ignored. Victoria did not speak right away. She simply nodded once, allowing the nurse to continue, because by now she understood that truth was not coming in a single moment. It was arriving in layers, each one removing what little doubt remained. The tablet was turned toward the group, displaying a log that did not match the others, a temporary override, brief but significant, and the timestamp aligned perfectly with the footage they had just watched, tightening the pattern into something undeniable, something complete. Daniel's expression did not collapse, not entirely, but it shifted again, the edges of control thinning, the certainty he once carried now replaced by calculation, the kind that comes when someone realizes the outcome is no longer in their hands. "Who else has access to this level of override?" Victoria asked, her voice calm, almost neutral, but beneath it was something sharper, something that did not need to raise volume to increase pressure. The nurse hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. Only executive clearance. And that answer echoed louder than anything else in the room, because it narrowed the field down to almost nothing. Victoria exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of confirmation, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to steady the clarity that had now fully formed. Because once truth becomes clear, it demands action. Behind her, Lily shifted again, a small movement but stronger than before, her hand tightening slightly around her mother's fingers, grounding her, reminding her of what this was really about. And Victoria opened her eyes, the softness gone now, replaced entirely by resolve. All internal systems are to be secured immediately, she said, her voice carrying across the room without effort, and the staff moved without hesitation, because authority no longer needed explanation. It had been proven. Daniel finally spoke again. But now there was something different in his tone, something closer to urgency than control. Victoria, think carefully, he said, but the words felt delayed, like they belonged to an earlier version of this moment, one that no longer existed. She looked at him, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. I am, she replied, and that was all, because anything more would have been unnecessary. The monitor behind her continued its steady, fragile rhythm, each sound a reminder that Lily was still here, still present, still the center of everything. And as the room moved into action, as systems locked and records were preserved, the focus sharpened into something undeniable, a transition from uncertainty to accountability. Near the doorway, a security officer glanced down the empty hallway for a brief second, as if expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, only quiet space where a boy had once stood and changed everything without leaving a trace. And back inside the room, as the final pieces aligned and the truth settled fully into place, Victoria Hay stood not as a grieving mother anymore, but as someone who had just uncovered something that would not be undone, something that had waited in silence until the exact moment it could no longer remain hidden. There is a reason patterns repeat, Victoria said quietly, almost to herself, as the final system locks confirmed across the monitors, each soft chime marking another door closing on whatever had been quietly operating beneath her control. And in that moment the hospital room no longer felt like a place of uncertainty, but a place where everything had been drawn into focus, sharp and irreversible. Daniel stood still, but now stillness no longer served him, because every eye in the room had shifted from observation to judgment, not spoken, not declared, but understood, and the absence of his usual authority hung heavier than any accusation. Pull the full audit trail, Victoria continued, her tone even, controlled, as if she were reviewing quarterly numbers instead of dismantling something far more personal. And the technician nodded quickly, fingers moving across the screen as layers of data unfolded, timestamps aligning, overrides connecting, a quiet architecture of decisions that had once been invisible now forming a complete and undeniable structure. Behind her, Lily's breathing steadied further, each inhale stronger than the last, her presence no longer fragile but returning. And as her eyes shifted again, slower now but deliberate, they moved from Daniel back to her mother. And in that glance there was something unmistakable, not just awareness, but confirmation, as if she were telling her without words that what they were uncovering was real. Victoria's hand tightened slightly around Lily's, grounding herself not in anger, but in purpose, because this was no longer about what had been done, it was about what would happen next. You said she was confused, Victoria said, finally turning her full attention back to Daniel, her gaze unwavering. But confusion does not create patterns, and the words did not rise, did not strike, they settled, heavy and precise, leaving no space for deflection. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but whatever explanation he had prepared no longer fit the reality in front of him, and for the first time, he hesitated long enough for everyone to see it clearly, not a pause of strategy, but a pause of limitation. Near the doorway, security shifted slightly, not aggressively, not dramatically, but enough to redefine the space, to make it clear that movement now had boundaries, and Daniel felt that too. The subtle but undeniable transition from influence to restriction. Everything is recorded, the technician said quietly, almost as if stating it made it more real, and the screen reflected it back in numbers and logs that no longer looked like data but like decisions, choices that had been made in silence now speaking louder than any defense. Victoria exhaled once, steady and controlled, then nodded, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, as if acknowledging that the line between doubt and certainty had been crossed completely. Then we proceed, she said, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything that had come before. Because they were not reactive, they were final. Lily's fingers moved again, stronger this time, her grip tightening just enough to be felt, and Victoria looked down briefly, her expression softening for a fraction of a second before returning to its focused clarity, because she understood now that survival was not the end of this story, it was the beginning of something else. Outside the room, down the quiet hallway where the lights reflected off empty floors, there was no sign of the boy who had started all of this. No footprint, no shadow, nothing to prove he had ever been there. And yet inside, everything he had said continued to unfold with exact precision, as if he had not just seen the truth, but delivered it at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. There is one gap, the technician said, his voice quieter now, but carrying a new kind of weight, the kind that makes people stop even when they think everything has already been revealed. And Victoria's eyes shifted back to the screen, narrowing slightly, because in her world gaps were never empty. They were intentional. Show me, she said, and the data adjusted again, the timeline expanding, revealing a narrow window where the system recorded nothing at all. No access, no changes, no entries. Just silence. And in a place where everything was monitored down to the second, silence was not absence, it was interference. Daniel's shoulders tightened, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough, because now every movement was being seen through a different lens, one where normal behavior no longer looked normal. Explain the gap, Victoria said, her tone unchanged, calm but absolute. And for the first time Daniel did not answer immediately, his eyes flicking toward the screen, then toward the door, then back again, a sequence too quick to control, too real to hide. System errors happen, he said finally, but the explanation landed weak, incomplete, because everyone in that room understood systems, and they understood patterns, and this did not fit either. Not like this, the technician replied under his breath, almost without realizing he had spoken, but the truth has a way of slipping out when it is already fully formed. Behind them, Lily shifted again, her breathing stronger now, her awareness growing, and she turned her head slightly, her gaze moving across the room until it settled once more on Daniel. And this time there was no hesitation in it, no confusion, just recognition, and recognition is something that cannot be programmed or mistaken. Victoria followed that gaze slowly, deliberately, and when she looked back at Daniel, there was no uncertainty left, not even a trace. You needed time no one could trace, she said, not asking, not accusing, but stating it as a conclusion that had already been reached, and the room felt it. That shift from discovery to declaration. Daniel's lips parted as if to respond. But whatever answer, he had no longer belonged to this moment, because the truth had already outrun him. And in that silence, in that fraction of time where he said nothing, everything became clear. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, each sound now louder, more certain, like a countdown not to an ending, but to accountability. And Victoria stepped forward once more, closing the final distance between assumption and action. Secure the full system backup, she said, and the command moved instantly, because hesitation had no place left here. Near the doorway, a security officer glanced again into the hallway, the same empty stretch of polished floor, and for a brief second something flickered across his face. Not fear, not confusion, but the sense that something had already passed through this space and left its mark without leaving anything behind. Inside the room, the silence that followed was not uncertain anymore. It was final, the kind of silence that comes after everything has been said without needing words. And as Victoria stood there, her hands still connected to her daughter, her eyes fixed on the man who no longer had control over the narrative. The truth settled completely into place. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And once something becomes undeniable, it does not ask what happens next, it decides it. You thought silence would protect you, Victoria said. And this time her voice carried something new. Not anger, not grief, but finality. The kind that closes doors permanently. And the room seemed to settle around that tone as the last fragments of uncertainty disappeared. Daniel did not respond. Not immediately, because there was nothing left that could reshape what had already been revealed. And when a man who always has answers chooses silence, it is no longer strategy, it is recognition. The technician continued working, pulling deeper layers of the system, and the screen shifted again, exposing backup traces, fragments of activity that had been masked but not erased, because systems remember even when people try to make them forget, and those fragments aligned with the gap, filling it not completely, but enough to remove doubt, enough to turn suspicion into structure. There, the technician said quietly, pointing to a secondary log, one that recorded an external override command routed internally, subtle, precise, and tied to a credential that now carried more weight than a name ever could. And Victoria did not need to ask whose it was. She already knew, because the pattern had already spoken. Behind her, Lily drew in a deeper breath, the sound soft but steady, her chest rising with more strength than before, and when she spoke again, her voice was still faint, still fragile, but clearer than it had been moments ago. I heard everything, she said. And the words moved through the room like a quiet wave, because they did not accuse, they confirmed. Victoria turned instantly, her focus shifting back to her daughter, her hand tightening gently around Lily's as if anchoring her to this moment. You are safe, she said again, softer now, but no less certain, and Lily's eyes flickered with recognition, not fear, not confusion, but understanding. The kind that comes from witnessing something others could not see. Daniel took a small step back, almost instinctive, but the space behind him was no longer open. Security had closed it without force, without urgency, just presence, and presence was enough, because there was nowhere left to move that would change what had already happened. All records are being preserved, one of the staff members said, and the statement felt procedural, but in this moment it carried weight, because preservation meant permanence, and permanence meant this would not disappear. Victoria straightened slowly, her posture shifting into something unmistakable, not a mother standing beside a hospital bed, but a woman who had just uncovered a truth that demanded consequence. And when she looked at Daniel again, there was no question left in her expression, no hesitation, only clarity. It is over, she said, and the words did not echo. They settled, final and complete, because they were not about the moment, they were about everything that would follow it. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, each sound now aligned with something stronger, something returning, and Lily's hand moved again, more certain this time, her fingers curling slightly as if reclaiming control over her own presence. And Victoria felt it, that shift from survival to return, and it grounded her completely. Outside, the hallway remained still, empty, unchanged, but inside, everything had changed, every detail, every assumption, every piece of silence that had once hidden something now exposed it fully. And as the room moved forward, not loudly, not chaotically, but with precise, deliberate action, the truth stood at the center of it all, not needing to be proven anymore, only carried forward, because once truth is revealed at the right moment, it does not ask for permission to exist, it simply remains, impossible to ignore and even harder to escape. Say his name, Victoria said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a precision that left no room for anything except the truth, and the room, already stripped of doubt, seemed to lean into that moment as if even the air understood what was being asked. Lily's breathing steadied further, each inhale more certain than the last, and though her voice was still fragile, it carried something unmistakable now, clarity shaped by memory. Daniel, she whispered, and the single word settled into the space like a final confirmation, not an accusation, not a guess, but a direct line drawn from what had been hidden to what now stood fully exposed. No one moved immediately, not because they did not understand, but because understanding had already reached its limit, and now they were stepping into something beyond it, consequence. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, not in denial, but in recognition, and when he opened them again, whatever remained of control had faded into something quieter, something that no longer tried to reshape the moment, but simply existed within it. You misinterpreted, he began, but the words did not complete themselves. They fell short, because even he could hear it now. The distance between explanation and reality had grown too wide to cross. Victoria did not interrupt. She did not need to, because interruption implies debate, and there was no debate left, only alignment between what had been said, what had been recorded, and what had now been spoken aloud. All executive access is revoked, she said, her tone even, but final, and the command moved instantly through the room, not because of authority alone, but because it was now supported by something stronger, certainty. One of the security officers stepped forward, not aggressively, not urgently, but with a presence that shifted the balance completely, and Daniel felt it, the quiet closing of options, the realization that influence no longer extended beyond this moment. Behind Victoria, Lily's fingers tightened again, a small but deliberate movement, and Victoria turned her head slightly, her focus softening just enough to acknowledge it, grounding herself once more in what mattered most, because everything unfolding around them traced back to that single connection. You changed it, Lily said again, her voice gaining strength, not volume, but clarity, and this time the words did not drift, they landed exactly where they needed to, reinforcing what had already been revealed. The technician adjusted the display one last time, aligning logs, footage, and overrides into a single continuous timeline. No gaps, no ambiguity, just a sequence that told its own story without interpretation. And in that sequence, every detail pointed in one direction. Daniel looked at the screen, then at Victoria, and for the first time since this began, there was no attempt to redirect, no attempt to challenge, only the quiet awareness that the narrative had moved beyond him entirely. This will be reviewed fully, Victoria said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of process, because what came next was not emotional. It was procedural, structured, irreversible. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, each sound now consistent, reliable, a reminder that life had returned where it had nearly been lost, and that return carried with it a clarity that could not be undone. Near the doorway, the hallway remained still, empty, unchanged, and yet everything that had happened inside this room traced back to a presence that left no record, no entry, no explanation. Only the truth delivered at exactly the right moment. And as Victoria stood there, her hand still holding her daughter's, her eyes steady and unyielding, the final layer of silence that had once protected everything now lay completely removed, leaving only what had always been there, waiting to be seen. He knew you would find out, Lily said softly, her voice still fragile but no longer uncertain, and the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not exposing something new, but revealing something deeper, something that reached beyond Daniel, beyond the system, beyond even the hospital itself. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, because this was not the end of the pattern. It was an extension of it, and patterns do not stop unless something stops them. Who? Victoria asked, her tone steady, her attention fully on her daughter now, because in this moment Lily was not just recovering, she was remembering, and memory, when it returns after silence, does not come back empty. Lily's gaze shifted slightly, not toward Daniel this time, but toward the ceiling, as if following a thread that only she could see. The boy, she whispered, and the room changed again, not with movement, but with realization, because until now he had been an interruption, an anomaly, something outside the system, but now he was part of it, connected to everything that had unfolded. Victoria felt it instantly, that alignment, the way his words, his timing, his certainty had never felt random, and now they no longer could be explained as coincidence. What about him? Victoria asked, softer now, not commanding, but searching, because this was no longer about control, it was about understanding. Lily's fingers tightened slightly around her mother's hand, her breathing steadying as if the act of speaking was anchoring her further into the present. "He has been here before," she said, and the words carried a quiet certainty that made the room feel smaller, more contained, as if something unseen had just been brought closer. One of the nurses glanced at the others, confusion passing silently between them, because records did not show that, systems did not confirm that, but the absence of proof did not erase the weight of what was being said. "That is not possible," someone murmured under their breath. But the words felt weaker now, because impossibility had already been broken. Once in this room, and once something breaks, it does not easily restore itself. Victoria did not dismiss it, did not question it, because she had already learned something critical in the last hour. That truth does not always arrive through systems. Sometimes it arrives through people, through moments, through things that cannot be logged or recorded. "When?" Victoria asked, her voice quiet but focused, and Lily's eyes flickered again, searching inward. "When I could not wake up," she said, "he talked to me." And the room stilled completely, because that statement did not just explain his presence, it redefined it. Victoria felt a chill move through her, not fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when something impossible begins to make its own kind of sense. Because the boy had not just appeared, he had arrived at the exact moment he was needed. With knowledge he should not have had, with certainty no one else possessed. Near the doorway, one of the security officers shifted slightly, glancing once more into the empty hallway, and this time the emptiness felt different, not just absence, but something that had already fulfilled its purpose and left without needing acknowledgement. Victoria looked down at Lily, her expression no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but grounded in something deeper than explanation, because not everything that matters can be explained, and not everything that is real can be proven. "You are safe now," she said again. But this time the words carried a different meaning, not just about survival, but about truth, about the fact that whatever had been hidden was now fully exposed, and whatever had helped reveal it did not need to stay to be understood. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, calm and consistent, and in that quiet sound there was a sense of closure beginning to form, not loud, not dramatic, but complete, because the moment that had been waiting to happen had already passed, and everything that remained was simply what followed after truth had done its work. The room grew quieter than it had ever been, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place. And in that silence Victoria Hayes stood beside her daughter not as someone searching for answers, but as someone who had finally seen them all at once. Lily's breathing was steady now, each inhale measured, each exhale certain, and the machines that once sounded like warnings now sounded like reassurance, a rhythm that no longer fought to exist, but simply did. And Victoria held her hand with a calm that had replaced months of uncertainty, because the fear that once filled this room had been replaced by something else, something stronger, clarity. Daniel Reeves was no longer speaking, no longer directing, no longer shaping anything in the room, and his presence had shifted into something smaller, contained not by force but by the undeniable weight of what had been revealed, because when truth aligns from every direction, it does not need to raise its voice, it simply remains. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, preserving records, confirming logs, securing everything that would carry this moment forward beyond these walls. And yet none of that movement felt chaotic, it felt precise, controlled, as if the entire system had recalibrated itself around a single point of truth. Victoria looked down at Lily again, her expression softening just enough to acknowledge what mattered most, and Lily met her gaze with a quiet strength that had not been there before, not because she had gained something new, but because what had been taken from her had now been returned. And in that exchange no words were needed, because everything that mattered had already been said. "He said you would understand," Lily whispered after a moment, her voice still gentle but grounded, and Victoria did not ask who, because she already knew, not through evidence, not through records, but through the way everything had unfolded exactly when it needed to, with a precision no system could replicate. Near the doorway, the hallway remained empty, the same polished floors, the same quiet lights, but now it felt different, not because something was there, but because something had already passed through, leaving nothing behind except the truth it delivered. One of the nurses glanced down that hallway again, just for a second, as if expecting to see a shadow, a movement, any trace of the boy who had changed everything. But there was nothing, and somehow that absence felt complete, not missing, not unfinished, but exactly as it should be. Victoria turned back to the room, her posture steady, her voice calm. "We move forward," she said. And the words were not dramatic, not loud, but they carried finality, because forward was the only direction left. The past had already been uncovered, the truth had already been revealed, and what remained was the consequence of that clarity. The monitor continued its quiet rhythm, the sound no longer urgent but steady, consistent, alive, and Lily's fingers curled slightly in her mother's hand, a small movement that carried more meaning than anything that had happened before, because it was not about what had been done, it was about what had survived. And as the room settled into that new reality, as every person present understood that something irreversible had taken place, not just in systems or records but in truth itself, the final weight of the moment revealed something deeper than justice, something quieter, something lasting, that sometimes the most powerful force is not the one that stays to be seen, but the one that arrives exactly when it is needed, speaks only what must be said, and leaves without asking to be understood, because some truths do not need witnesses. They only need the right moment to be set free.